Welcome, everyone. My name is Ann Dolan, and today I'm the host of our webinar, Getting Past Procrastination, how to help your child get more organized, focused, and motivated, all without being the bad guy. And today I have a special guest with me. I have Dr. Maria Zamiti, who's the president and founder of Georgetown Psychological Services, with offices in McLean, Bethesda, and Georgetown. So Maria, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Ann.
Hi there. All right, so I thought we would start by going through some of the issues that kids face when they procrastinate and how parents feel about it along the way. You know, when I started out my career as a teacher, I was just out of graduate school, and I had a classroom full of kids with such diverse needs. And after school, after I would pack up my things for the next day, I would drive to kids' homes and tutor them. And I found that after a few years, this was my calling in life, working with kids one-on-one. And as a tutor, I heard things in kids' homes that I never heard about in the classroom. And even today, actually next month will be 20 years that I've had this company, Educational Connections. I started it in 1998 when I left my teaching job and decided to do what I love more than anything in the world. I realized that parents and kids really struggle with many things, you know, not just grades and academics, but there are also things that come along during the day that can really affect their academic performance at school. So over the last 20 years, I've talked to thousands and thousands of parents that call looking for help for their kids. And I will tell you, they have a lot in common. You know, when I talk to these parents, I find that their kids struggle for specific reasons. For example, about a third of the kids we see that parents call us about are bright but disorganized. And these are kids that are really smart, but they're just super scattered. We also talk to parents whose kids have subject struggles. You know, they're struggling in a specific area of school, like math or science or writing. And then we have the kids that are stressed out perfectionists. And Maria is going to help us diagnose, and not really diagnose, but talk about how we can help those kids, because those kids seem to be, at least from what I see, on the rise in some of the issues that they face. Here's the thing that all parents have in common. They often say that their child is a professional procrastinator, that they're really good at putting things off that they could do now. And here are the things that I hear from parents. Ugh, I'm just so sick of nagging my daughter. I don't have time for this. I have 2 other kids too. I just can't micromanage my kid and make sure that they get going on their homework. Parents will say things like, if it's this bad now, what's it going to be like when they're in high school? And then they have questions like, how can my kid be so smart but so totally scattered? And ultimately, what these parents are saying is they feel like they've become the homework police. So it's very familiar. You know, most kids procrastinate. Most adults procrastinate. It's kind of human nature. But in a self-report of high school and college students, 86% of high schoolers say they procrastinate on a regular basis. 88% of college students say they do it. And 92% of college males say they do it regularly. So it seems to be that boys perhaps procrastinate a little bit more than girls, or at least they report it to be so. Here's what I know after many years of working with these kids directly and talking to lots of parents, whether they're bright but disorganized kids, they have subject struggles, or they're perfectionist in nature. They procrastinate for various reasons. Some kids just can't find the muster or the energy to get going. They feel a little bit indifferent about getting started on the activity they have to do. Some kids want to get going, but they feel really overwhelmed, like the task feels big and they're underprepared. Yet other kids feel like if they don't get it perfect and all right, why bother? So they often don't get started because they're feeling so anxious about the situation. So I want to welcome my friend Maria. Maria, when you see kids in your practice, what are some of the things that you see when it comes to procrastination?
Well, I mean, I guess one of the things I'd like to say is that, for some kids, they procrastinate a bit, it doesn't cause a lot of stress. They get things done. They turn it in on time. So at the end of the day, it's in whatever way working for them. But of course, the kids that we see, it typically is not working for them. So, if I were to kind of think about them in two distinct groups, I would say that, the kids that are struggling the most that we're seeing typically in terms of questions about why are they procrastinating. The first group would be, of course, kids with the executive functioning challenges, kids with ADHD, that truly are struggling to get started with things. And we can talk a little bit about that. And the second group, of course, are the anxious kids and the perfectionists. And, ultimately some of these kids even stop going to school because the loop has just gotten so, overwhelming for them. So those are, the two groups of kids that we mostly see. And often parents come to us to ask the question, why is this is one of the main behaviors they're seeing. And it's so frustrating for parents, and everybody's just really looking for tools. And part of that is understanding why it's happening in the first place.
It seems like once you understand what your child goes through, that's half of the problem solved. Would you say that's the case? Just understanding the nature of the beast?
Absolutely. And the way that you might deal with it would be quite different, for kids with ADHD versus kids with high anxiety, although, the symptoms can look the same, but the strategies may be a little bit different.
Great, Maria. Thank you. Oh, and also I should mention that parents, as you're listening along, if you have a question, there's a chat box on your screen, and please type the question in now, because we have a lot of parents on the line and we're going to be answering questions at the end of the webinar. So please go ahead and type those questions in now or as we go along. So, Maria, you mentioned this thing called executive functions, which are really these cognitive processes in the frontal lobe of the brain, and they're really important for school success. Can you tell us a little bit about the connection between executive functions and maybe kids with weak executive functions and ADHD?
Sure. So, that's really the core of ADHD is these kids struggle with, what is procrastination? It's trouble initiating a task, getting started on something, managing your time around it, not getting distracted by something else, and ultimately finishing it. And these are just the core challenges with these kids. And, so for them, they have so much trouble regulating their attention. So while, of course, in one way, they can get super focused very quickly if you give them a phone, a Game Boy, if you give them a set of Legos, if if there's an Instagram post. There's so many things that get them so focused, but these other things that are less interesting, less exciting, it is just harder for them to get started. And it truly is hard for them. And I think when we're talking to parents, we're really trying to help them understand that it's not willful, although bad habits, of course, can get started in this loop. But they're not lazy kids. They're doing the best they can. It's just that their frontal lobe is not quite developed yet and is a bit behind in terms of development. So we need to help them along for quite some time.
Yes, I've heard that some of these kids can be delayed about 2 to 3 years. Would you say that's so?
Yes. So when you're really feeling as a parent, especially frustrated and confused by the whole thing, if you sort of minus their age by 3 years, it really can make a lot more sense, all of these behaviors.
Thanks, Maria. When we see kids with weak executive functioning skills or a diagnosed with ADHD, they have a lot of things in common. As Maria said, just getting started, that task initiation is really hard for them. And then once they get started, sustaining the effort and inhibiting all those distractions around them are equally as difficult. But at the end of the day, what I've found with a lot of kids that I've worked with over the years is that the crux of their issue is just staying organized and then being able to manage their time along the way. And often when you have a bright kid living in your home, or as a teacher, you have a bright kid sitting in a seat in your classroom, and you know they're really smart because a lot of these kids are highly verbal and they just bring so much to the table, yet what they turn into the teacher or their report card grades don't reflect how bright they are. It can be really frustrating for both parents and for kids. And often that's when parents take on this role of homework police. I mean, parents will do anything to get their kids to do three things: to get started, to focus, and to finish. So they will often nag and poke and prod, cajole, bribe, negotiate. They'll do anything just to get their kids going in the right direction. But I tell you, I've never met a parent that likes the role of homework police. Every parent I know wants to desperately turn in their badge. They don't want this role anymore. So, how do you turn in your badge? Well, you can change the approach. Us as parents, we can approach our kids differently, or we can enlist the help of a coach or a therapist, which is what Maria does. So, let's talk a little bit about what parents can do. So we mentioned that whether these kids have weak executive functioning issues or a diagnosis of ADHD or none of the above, but they're just having difficulty with procrastination, planning ahead and managing time are vital. And a friend of mine named Ari Tuckman, he's a therapist in Pennsylvania. I went to a workshop of his, this was a number of years ago, and I thought he just so described these kids perfectly when he said, these kids either have a soft or loud internal clock. So a soft clock kid is a kid for whom time ticks very softly. They're rarely on time. If they have to be at soccer practice at 5 o'clock, for example, they're still on their Xbox at 4:50. They don't have a sense of elapsed time, so it's really hard for them to get going in the right direction because they're really unaware. But you may also have a kid with a loud clock living in your home, or you may know somebody like this. This person is always on time because for them, time ticks very loudly, and they have a great sense of elapsed time. They know when they have to be somewhere. They even study ahead a couple of days, and they're able to parse out their time really well. For the kids that we're talking about today, these are soft clock kids. And sometimes parents will say, he didn't have a great teacher in second grade, or, I think it was that I let him play too many video games when he was little. But I don't know if any of these things really matter. I wonder if it's more that these kids were really born with soft clocks and it's just harder for them to manage their time. In addition to being a soft clock kid, many of these kids also have short time horizons. For example, if let's say a big essay is due on Friday and there's research involved in a rough draft, and then you have to perfect the rough draft and turn in a final copy, kids with short time horizons, if it's due on Friday, they'll often start on Thursday. A child with a long time horizon might start on Monday or Tuesday, knowing that, for example, they've got their softball tournament that week and they really need to kind of parse out their time and manage it well so that they're not too stressed out and they get it done on time. So soft clock kids are often short time horizon kids. And then, kind of as Maria said before, these soft clock, short time horizon kids fall into one of two buckets. They can either be functional procrastinators or dysfunctional procrastinators. Maria, you kind of mentioned the functional procrastinators may not feel pain around it because they know they should get started earlier, but in one way or another, they still get the work done and nobody really knows about it. Yeah, they know about it and maybe mom is stressed out, but the teacher never knows about it. It's not reflected on the report card. But on the other hand, we have dysfunctional procrastinators who, no matter, regardless of starting late at night and trying to focus the best they can, they just cannot get it all done. And it comes crashing down. So now the teacher knows about it. It's on the report card. Obviously, the student knows it and the parents know about it as well. So let's talk about routines that we can use with kids for planning ahead. When we help kids in this domain, we often elicit the help of educational coaches. And educational coaches they're kind of like specialized tutors that work specifically in the areas of organization, time management, and study skills. Whereas a tutor might be like a math tutor or a science tutor, a coach may help with academics, but then they're also going to help with these other things too. So let me share with you a couple of strategies that our coaches use. And then Maria, I want to
Sure.
have you talk about things that a therapist can help with too. So let's talk about the very basics. You know, for some kids, even just getting started on the daily tasks that should be routine is really difficult. There's lots of times kids can start homework. They can start it right after school, after about a 30-minute break, and this is often ideal for elementary kids. They can start it before dinner, after dinner, before bed. And then recently, two kids told me, yes, and you can start it before school. Another kid said, you forgot about on the bus. I'm like, oh, yes, I did forget about that one. And then another child reminded me, oh, you can do it in Eagle time, which is their study hall right before the class. So there are lots of times kids can start homework. But I tell you, our soft clock kids are not starting homework early. They're starting it at the very last minute. So we can get our kids into a routine of even just cracking open the books at a certain time. So you could have the routine in your house if you know you have a couple of procrastinators living under your roof that, for example, before dinner, everybody just lays out what they have to do. Maybe they lay out their books and their essay, or maybe they open up the document on their laptop that they have to work on. Just having that visual of what you have to do actually decreases procrastination. So when our coaches go in and work with kids, we teach kids these little tricks. You know, you really don't want to start something and it's your tendency to put it off. What are some little hacks that you can do to prevent that? And this is one of them, just to have that visual. Also, to use weekends well. Many of the students we work with, they just show up on Monday to school. They're just there. And they haven't really taken time to look ahead at the week in terms of, well, do I have a big project? Do I have a test? Do I have a homework assignment due on Monday? They're just kind of there. And when they start there on a Monday, they're already starting out from a point of weakness. And it often just builds, and that creates anxiety and a lot of overwhelm for our students. So one thing that we do and that parents can do is to sit with kids on Sundays or before they start the week and ask, you know, what do you have that's coming up this week? What are the big things? And then also, what are the extracurriculars, the things that might get in your way, the things that, you know, might take up a chunk of time that will make finishing that lab, for example, difficult for you that night. Simply having that discussion and looking ahead on the weekend is helpful. But let's talk a little bit about advanced routines. You know, one of the things that we often do is help kids with block scheduling. Maria, I'm not sure if you've seen this too, but kids tend to struggle a lot with block scheduling. Do you see that?
You know, it's not something actually that I know too much about with them. We don't discuss it probably to that level that you do as a coach.
So this might be more of an educational intervention.
Right.
I've seen that, you know, at first when I heard about block scheduling when it first came out, and it has since trickled down into the middle school. But when it first came out, I'm like, wow, this is really great. You know, kids have longer periods of time with their teachers, so they'll have longer to get their assignments done. But it actually is not helpful at all to kids with weak executive functioning skills. Because if they have a class Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, let's say it's the Monday, Wednesday, Friday rotation, if something's due on Wednesday, they're not starting it on Monday. They're starting it at 9 or 10 o'clock on Tuesday. And that in itself puts them at a disadvantage because if they get stuck, if they don't know how to do it, if they're not even sure what to do, they've got no one to ask. They can't go to their teacher. They can't typically ask somebody else at that late date. So we help kids to break things down in chunks to just get started on that task on the day it's assigned. And that's key. So we see kids that, you know, have difficulty with block scheduling in general, or just starting things that even aren't on block scheduling for multiple reasons. And we talked about before, you know, some kids have these executive functioning issues where it's hard for them to break things down and get going. Some kids don't have that internal oomph to get going in the first place, and some are just kind of anxious. So I want to give you a couple of educational strategies that we use as coaches to help kids. And then, Maria, I wanted to talk to you about some psychological ways that you help kids too. So, what I've found is that for the kids that can't muster the energy, it has to be so easy that they're willing to at least try it. So, it can't be like if they've got a 3-page essay, they can't say to themselves, okay, I'm going to sit down for 2 hours and I'm going to bump out this essay because I've waited to the last minute and I've got to get it done. In fact, it's better if they break it into chunks. There's 2 ways you can do this. One is by time. And time is, I love using timers for kids. You know, when I first started out as a tutor, I used timers exclusively for little kids. But now, as I got going, I use timers for high schoolers. And as I've worked with college students over the years, I've used timers for them. And I tell you, the older the child is, it's almost like they benefit from the timer even more. Having an external timer is often better than a timer on your phone, because if it's on your phone, you kind of can go down a rabbit hole of looking at other things on your phone. But the idea is that you want to set a timer for a short period of time. So for an older student, it might be like 15 minutes. And you say to yourself, I'm going to work as hard as I can, as best as I can, focus as much as I can for just 15 minutes. It could be 10 minutes. We call this the tolerable 10. Anybody can tolerate anything for 10 minutes. For little kids, we call it 5 minutes of fury. Anybody can work furiously for 5 minutes. But I would say the mistake that a lot of kids make is that they expect themselves to work for these extended period of times, and that never works. I once worked with a college student who was on academic probation, and she beat herself up like crazy because she would like parse out this big chunk of time, like 3 hours, and she would go to the library and she would say to herself, I got to get all this stuff done. And by 2.5 hours, she would look up and realize she'd hardly done anything at all. And she was actually really upset with herself. So we set up a strategy of working in variable increments, and it helped her tremendously. And she started with 15 minutes and then built upon that because she could not tolerate these extended periods of time. It can be by task. So task is you've got something to do in math. Do your easy problems first just to get your brain primed to get going. For little kids, fold the paper in half and just do half the page. But when it comes to actually getting that stuff done, you also have to be focused. So I want to share with you a couple of things that we found helpful for focus. Now, often when our coaches go to a student's home, we'll help set up a study area if the child needs that. Because oftentimes, you know, you're going to be more focused and less likely to procrastinate if you have a relatively distraction-free place to study. So that's really important. Because some kids, they're Super Bowl kids. These are kids that, I don't know if you watched the Super Bowl recently, but I remember it was on from 6:30 to 10:30. So it was on for 4 hours, but they only play the game for an hour. And I think a lot of our kids are like this. They say that they're up in their rooms doing homework for many, many hours, for 3-4 hours, but they may only have an hour of homework to do, yet it's taking a very long time because they're taking time out for things like checking Snapchat and Instagram, or they're watching a YouTube video. So they're just so distracted, it kind of contributes to their tendency for procrastination. So some advanced strategies, you know, this is from a fellow out of Stanford who did a study with college students looking at how they deal with the effects of technology on studying. And he found that when these kids put their phones in a completely separate part of the room where they had to physically stand up, walk, and get their phone, and then check their phone for a couple of minutes, they did far better. So the way it worked is 20 minutes on, set the timer, 20 minutes, hardcore studying for 20 minutes, stand up, walk over to your phone, send a couple text messages, a break for a couple of minutes, and then back. So for some kids, they do need that kind of structure, and these are things that we help teach them because it may not always come naturally to them. You may have heard me, if you've been on a webinar before, talk about these apps because they're kid recommended and they're really helpful to kids that are somehow distracted and procrastinate because they're so many of their assignments are online these days. So self-control is for Mac and stay focused is a Chrome extension. They both do the same things. They allow kids to blacklist the websites they deem to be distracting. It could be Reddit, it could be YouTube, it could be Yahoo Fantasy Sports, whatever. And then no matter what they do, they set the time increment for, say, 20 minutes. If they try to take the app off or restart their computer, they can't get to those websites. And it gives them that focused study time to get their work done. And then the one that I love for phones is called Forest. And Forest is the same thing for phones, where you set it, when you click the button, a tree starts to grow on your home screen of your Forest app, and you can set it for any amount of time. I use it all the time for myself, and I'll set it for short periods of time, like 15 minutes, and I'll make sure I get my work done. And at the end of 15 minutes, if I haven't gone off track, like gone to Facebook or something, because if you do that, the tree will wither and die, the tree grows to fruition. And it's, you feel great because you've gotten something accomplished, and now you have a tree in your forest and you can start it up again if you want. So a couple of things that also help kids, this concept of distributed practice instead of doing everything the night before. Tons of research shows that if you took that hour you were going to study the night before an exam and you distributed it into 20 minutes Tuesday, 20 minutes Wednesday, 20 minutes Thursday for that exam on Friday, you'll do well. And also, we help our kids create these weird windows of time. Weird windows are these little tiny pockets of time that kids don't always use wisely. So it could be after school, they're waiting for the bus to go to their game. They have 20 minutes. What could they be doing during this 20 minutes instead of being on Instagram that might help them move in the right direction? And actually, we found that kids like weird windows because they feel the time is super short. And if they have a task to do, for example, create their flashcards in Quizlet, they're much more likely to do it because it's like this encapsulated period of time. And we found that by coaching kids through creating these weird windows and practicing it, they're later able to do it on their own. So at the end of the day, strong communication is key. And Maria, I'm wondering if you can help us kind of break down the types of communication with your kids. Let me share a couple of things with you, and then I'd love to get your comments on what you see in your practice. So what we often see is that parents can be reactive, and I know I've done this too lots of times, where you walk into your kid's room and they have a huge midterm tomorrow and they're on Xbox. And you're like, what are you doing? Are you kidding me? Have you studied yet? And it's never helpful, to be honest. It never gets the results we intended. So we say things like, you didn't start that yet? Don't forget to study for math. Do you have a test tomorrow? Oh, no wonder you got a C on that test. Or put down that phone. I'm taking it away. Or we can be proactive. We can set up a time to talk and we can ask powerful questions. So we might ask, instead of, do you have homework? What are your priorities today? It helps kids to get thinking about what they might do first, second, or third. But to be honest, none of our kids are going to come to us and say, wow, Mom, gee, that's such a brilliant question. Well, let's see. First, I'm going to do my science lab, and then I'm going to do my algebra, and then third, I'm going to study for history. But what they often do think about in their own minds, maybe without verbalizing it, is what they might do first and second. And even that is a step in the right direction, and it activates those executive functioning skills. So Maria, what are some things that parents can do when it comes to communicating with their kids that help with getting them to get started in the first place?
So, yeah, I think so many of the things that you're talking about with executive functioning also is related to kids with anxiety, because ultimately when you're anxious, you can't access those executive skills. And so many of the strategies that you're talking about for kids with executive functioning challenges would also go for kids who are anxious, because it helps kind of ease the anxiety and settle them into homework. Absolutely. With anxious kids, and it's so easy to do. I'm a parent. I get it. We go through all these struggles as well. But when you go into it with the questioning, and not only are you the homework police, but the phone, I mean, the arguments that go on around where the phone should be during homework time. And I mean, that is a major challenge for a lot of people. And while it seems really easy to just pull all of that away and not let them have access to it or keep it down in the kitchen, as kids get older, we really are wanting them to learn how to figure this out so that they can have it figured out before they're away from home. So I love the researchers' idea of, if they have it in their room, to keep it somewhere outside of reach where they have to actually get up and take a scheduled break. I mean, that's ultimately teaching these kids how to regulate their own phone and social media use, which, early on, I think you have a lot more control as to where those things are. But as they get older, it's important to help them figure this out for themselves. And so I think, these more positive questions, I mean, kids will still find these things even annoying sometimes. As the older they get, the less they want us to be involved in their homework and asking questions. And, sometimes I think it's important to give kids a chance to see what happens if I don't get involved with it. And, and sometimes you'll find that kids can sort of do these things without our interventions, but certainly not all kids. And some kids need more support than others. So yeah, it's as parents, it's hard to figure out when to step in and when to pull back. But the kids that we're talking about today, whether, more on the anxious side of things or, more on the ADHD executive function side of things, certainly need support, and they need to learn all the things that we want them to self-regulate, but they don't know how to do that intuitively. And that's what they need practice with. So on our end, working with parents is part of it, but particularly with anxious kids, it's usually not just anxiety around homework. So that is usually one piece of it in a long list of other things that the kids are feeling anxious about. Mm-hmm. Or the perfectionism extends far beyond, homework. Mm-hmm. So for a lot of these kids, I mean, actually having a therapist to work through it with them instead of mom or instead of dad, it's their coach. I mean, when we're working with kids who are anxious, I feel more like a coach than a therapist per se, because it really is trying to coach them through all these really strong feelings and helping them to kind of self-regulate more in the emotional part of things.
And Maria, I've heard that when kids are feeling super anxious, and it's obviously these things aren't just isolated to school. If you're feeling anxious about other parts of your life, that it doesn't get better. Anxiety doesn't get better as kids get older, but the good thing about it is it's highly treatable. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, these days, even when we see young kids with milder forms of anxiety, so they're afraid to sleep alone, or fears of the dark, or there's a lot of commotion around traveling and anxiety about what if we miss the plane? What if our luggage gets lost? I mean, we're seeing the signs so early now. And especially if there's a family history of anxiety. So if mom or dad has it, or it tends to run in families, then we intervene when kids are young, because they can really learn the skills. And there's some wonderful books that you don't have to bring your kids into therapy per se when they're, 6, 7, and 8. But if you're seeing some of these mild signs, there's some really good books out there. I love Tamar Chansky as a wonderful psychologist who's written a lot of great books. And Bonnie Zucker has written an excellent book. And it really helps parents know how to talk to their kids about their anxiety, how to support them, but not reinforce it, because ultimately, even the most well-meaning parents, we don't want to see our kids unhappy and stressed. And so we tend to try to help them feel better instead of sitting with that anxiety, which ultimately that's the experience they need to have, is to sit with it and see that, they can do things to make it get better.
Maria, can you repeat the names of the authors again?
Sure. Tamar Chansky, Chansky. Freeing Your Child from Anxiety is her book. And she also has one, Freeing Your Child from OCD. She's fantastic. And then Bonnie Zucker, and I can't remember the exact name of her book, but she's also written a great book. And hers is really cute because at the end of her book, she has something just for the kids to start to read about it and learn about it. So these are not always things that need a therapist's help, hand in, but a lot of parents need help themselves because, if you have anxious kids, oftentimes one of the parents also is struggling, and it requires a different way of parenting. Anxiety can cause as much frustration for parents as ADHD or any of these other things. And but it does take a little bit of a different kind of approach to be able to help these kids.
Thanks, Maria. And speaking about books, there's also a book I can recommend for parents on the communication end of things. And it's called How to Talk So Your Kids Will Listen.
Oh, yeah.
How to Listen So Your Kids Will
We'll
Talk. Oh my gosh. It's an oldie but goodie. It's been around for years, but it's probably my favorite book on communicating with kids. It helped me tremendously as a parent. So speaking of communication, there are lots of ways we can communicate better with our kids instead of telling them what to do. Often we'll say things like, did you study for your science test? But a better thing might be, what's the first thing you might do to get ready for your science test? And don't expect an elaborate answer, and don't maybe expect an answer at all, but it may get the wheels turning in your child's head. Instead of, you better start that history project, consider what's something small that you can do to get started. And anytime we can help kids to think about breaking things down into smaller pieces, it will reduce procrastination and help them to get started more independently and faster. So I have a whole list of things that parents can ask their kids on our website, which is ectutoring.com/powerful-questions. Bunch of them here, and you can see more of them on our website. So also, if this is something that you're interested in learning more about, organization and procrastination, homework battles in general, I have a class called Getting Past Procrastination that you can also access on our website. It's ectutoring.com/GPP, which stands for Getting Past Procrastination. So we'd love to do Q&A right now. Rochelle, do you have any questions for us that parents may have called in about? And if not, I have something that somebody phoned into me earlier.
Sure. Yeah. I guess the biggest one that comes across from parents is, especially with the functional procrastinators, because they wait till last minute, but they still get good grades, so they don't see the negative consequences. Mm-hmm. In that case, how can you coach that student to have better tools going forward?
Maria, do you want to take a stab at that one, and then I can follow up?
Sure. One of the questions I guess I would ask, because I would say the child may have some point in some of that, and I would understand, kind of how that might seem to them, but how much distress is involved that moment when they get started to the end result. And so I think that's number one, because maybe it seems functional because the grade is okay, or the grade might even be very good, but there's a lot of stress that's triggered that night before you're doing everything. And ultimately, it's just not a great long-term solution. So I think one of the ways that you can work with these kids at times is if they do have that stress factor, that never feels good for them. And so that's always anxious kids, or when they're feeling stressed, finding strategies to help reduce that is often a way to get in there and get them to try to do something new.
Maria, just another question about that. Would you ask them, you mentioned finding out how that makes them feel. Would you ever actually ask them the question?
Oh, sure. I think asking them how they feel, and maybe making comments about what you observe as a parent. I know, I get it. And you're right, your grades are very good, but I'm wondering if it might help so that you don't have to feel so upset and stressed the night before you're doing everything. Maybe there's some strategies we could come up with to help with that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Maria.
And another question a parent asked is, regarding organization. At what age would you say is the earliest time to kind of notice whether a child is disorganized or they're becoming a procrastinator?
Gosh, when it comes to organization, I've seen kids at a high school level that have the organizational skills of a second grader. It just
Yeah.
so varies. I think that's a tough question because what is normal is actually really broad. I mean, I've worked with a lot of kids over the years that aren't that organized, but they're still really functional and they can do enough to get by to be okay. What I think parents can do is if they notice that their child doesn't have a lot of internal structure, and you kind of know if your kid is internally organized or not. You walk in their room and it's a disaster all the time, and even with asking them to clean it up the next day, it kind of goes back to the way it was. You can do little things like take a picture of it when it's in a relatively neat state and put that picture on their dresser so they can refer to that as what it should look like. Because many kids that are disorganized, they don't have a mind's eye view of what it could look like. And our definition of being organized is and neat is completely different from theirs. But it also has to be really simple. Like being organized in your room only means that your clothes are on the hamper, you don't have any food in your room, and your sheets are pulled up or something like that, something super simple. And so for kids after school, their organization system could be when you walk into the house, you put your backpack on the hook. And this is what we do every day. It's a little thing, but it's what we do as adults. We all have a place we put our keys. We don't just put them at any random place every day because then we're not on autopilot and it's stressful trying to find them. So if your child doesn't have internal ways of being organized, think as a parent what you can do externally, just a couple of things to make life a little bit easier for them. But I don't know if there's any specific age.
Yeah, I would probably just add one great way to measure this might be to talk to the child's teacher, because, here they have, 15 to 30 students, depending on the school. And there are so many, they'll be able to tell you at least sort of comparable to their peers, kind of what their organizational skills are like. And we certainly see kids in early elementary school that, they're just a little out of sync with their peers. It's a little bit harder for them. They need a lot more reminders. They need, and so I think asking teachers would be a great way to assess some of that.
Great. And one last question that I'm going to kind of group up, but it kind of goes into how to communicate better with your child. For one, where, when it's something where you're kind of bringing up their disorganization, how do you talk to them about that before they become defensive?
Well, want me to say my first thought, and I've tried this with my own kids, when it's a topic that is not, and I can't believe how well this actually works, when it's a topic that is not something they especially are going to want to talk about, I have finally figured out that setting an appointment with them is a great strategy, because they know it's coming, they know it's sort of a certain duration. And with my kids that are older, I actually send them it through the Outlook, through my calendar, and I invite them to the appointment, and I invite my husband, and we sort of sit down around different things. And it's so much better to set up a structured time for them than trying to catch them on the way up to homework, or they don't, there's certain times when it's just, they're not going to hear you. And so I think when they just know that you're going to have this planned time, whether it's talking about organization or, we have to talk about, ACT prep, or we have to, whatever these things are that may not be so exciting for them to talk about, I think just giving them some control over it and knowing what's to come it makes the process a lot easier.
I agree, Maria. I've always found that having an appointment with kids is super helpful because it almost puts them on an even plane with you. Mm-hmm. It's almost like you're treating them like an adult. Hey, after dinner tonight at 7:30, can we talk about whatever it is? Does that work for you? And then you're kind of on neutral ground. So you're not in a moment where you're like really upset over something,
Right.
you're calmer and your child's calmer, and you're right. They kind of know that you're going to have a discussion about something for sure. Rochelle, anything else?
No, that was it. Thank you, guys.
Okay, great. Well, perfect timing. We're right at the end. I wanted to give everybody contact information for me and for Maria. Should you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us directly. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today, and thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you on another webinar. Have a great day, and thank you so much, Maria, for being our guest.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.